September 1971. Clearwater County, Minnesota. The smell hit Walter Gundersen before he reached the field line. Standing water and decomposed sedge grass, and the particular mineral bite of a water table that had come up through soil it had no business occupying. He was 63 years old, and had walked this northeast section of his farm every morning since 1938. When his father Arvid first handed him the responsibility of it. 33 years of the same route, the same hour, the same first press of his boot into the corner soil. That morning in September, the water came back in under a second. The ritual had always told him what he needed to know. He pressed the toe of his left boot, never the right, out of a habit he could not explain, into the ground at the northeast corner post, and counted the seconds before water welled back into the impression. 2 seconds. Workable. 4. Saturated. 6. Don't bring equipment in. That morning the water rose before he finished lifting his foot. The flooding had started properly in the spring of 1970, when the Clearwater River system crested at a level nobody in the county had recorded in writing, and the water table beneath his North 40 climbed and simply did not come back down. By that August, 11 acres of what had been his best corn ground stood under 6 inches of water. By September of 1971, the number was 31. His 1962 John Deere 4010 row crop tractor sat at the field's edge, where he had parked it 14 months earlier. The green had faded to a kind of sage gray. The rear tires had settled into soft ground and left shallow impressions that were now themselves filled with water. Nobody had moved it. Walter stood at the edge of those 31 acres and studied them the way he studied everything. Without expression, without movement, with his hands in his jacket pockets and his left boot still damp from the test. The water was clear in some places and dark with decomposing matter in others. Sedge grass had colonized the margins in thick mats. In the center of the lowest section, something green was growing that he had not planted. He stood there longer than breakfast. His wife Ruth watched him from the kitchen window and said nothing about it until supper. The question was not whether to save the land. The question, the one that kept him at the field's edge until the light shifted, was whether what he was looking at was something he was supposed to fight. If this story holds your attention the way it holds mine, subscribe. New stories go up every week. Donald Krebs had worked as the Clearwater County Agricultural Extension Agent since January of 1965, and he was the kind of man who delivered bad news with the energy of someone delivering good news, because to him there was no meaningful difference. Information was information. He had it. That was the whole transaction. He drove a green 1969 Ford F-100 with the county seal stenciled on the door, and drove it like the road had been built specifically for his use. He came out to the Gundersen property in October of 1971. Walter had not called him. Krebs had heard about the flooding from the Hendersons, who farmed 2 sections east, and he arrived with a clipboard and a folder of printed fact sheets from the University of Minnesota Extension Service, which he held against his chest the way a doctor holds a chart. He walked the field margin with Walter for approximately 15 minutes, speaking most of that time about drainage tile contractors in the county who did good work at competitive rates. He looked at the standing water for approximately 4 minutes. "Walter," he said, "you've got yourself a wetland." He said it the way a doctor names a condition, not unkindly, but with the finality of a man who has already moved past the diagnosis to the paperwork. He opened the folder and produced a one-page document with a grid of drainage tile specifications. "This ground is gone for row crops," Krebs said. "Best case, you drain it and you get 3, maybe 4 growing seasons before the water table pushes it right back up. You're fighting the hydrology here. The river changed its mind about this land." Walter looked at the document and did not take it. Krebs held it out a moment longer, then set it on top of the fence post. "I've seen 4 farms in this county with identical water table situations. All 4 tried to fight it. 2 of them are in bank workouts right now." He paused. He looked at the standing water once more, as though confirming his conclusion. "I'd look at selling the north section. Someone might want it for duck hunting." He wrote something on his clipboard and drove back toward town. At the Bagley Feed and Supply that November, someone asked Krebs about the Gundersen place, while Walter was 3 aisles over, looking at pump fittings. Krebs laughed, a short, certain sound, the laugh of a man who has been asked to confirm something obvious, and said, "Walter's a fine farmer, but that north section is a pond now. You can't farm a pond." 3 or 4 men in the store heard it, and nobody disagreed. Mervyn Holt, who had farmed east of the Gundersens for 20 years, said he'd offered to buy the north 40 for $800 total if Walter ever decided to cut his losses. Walter carried his pump fittings to the register and paid for them and drove home. He did not say anything to Ruth about what he had heard. But that night, after supper, he went to the shop and pulled a flat wooden crate from the shelf above the workbench, a crate that had been there since 1957, and set it on the work table and opened it. The crate held a Lane and Bowler centrifugal pump, model 14L12, mounted on a welded steel skid frame. His father Arvid had purchased it in 1954 from a farm liquidation sale in Beltrami County for $62, intending to use it for irrigation on the south fields. It had a 12-inch cast iron impeller housing, a 2-inch discharge port, and it could move 400 gallons per minute through 300 feet of lay-flat hose at consistent head pressure. Arvid had never used it for irrigation. The south fields had gotten enough rainfall in those years, and then Arvid's health had made large projects impossible. And then Arvid had died in the winter of 1961 without ever running the pump more than twice in demonstration. Walter had maintained it anyway. On the first Saturday of every month, rain or snow or harvest pressure, he ran the pump for 20 minutes against a closed valve to keep the seals seated and the impeller free. He changed the oil on the gear reducer every spring. He had replaced the shaft seal twice in 17 years. The pump ran at 1,950 RPM off a PTO shaft from a small tractor and had never given him a mechanical problem he could not solve in a single afternoon. Most of the men who had seen it in his shop assumed it was there because Walter was the kind of farmer who never discarded anything. Krebs had seen it once in 1967 during a shop visit about something unrelated, and asked about it briefly. Walter had told him what it was. Krebs had nodded and moved on. What Krebs did not know, what almost nobody in Clearwater County knew, was that Arvid Gundersen had not bought that pump for irrigation. He had bought it because he had spent the summer of 1953 traveling through northern Minnesota, studying something else entirely. Arvid had kept a ledger. Not a farm ledger of expenses and yields, a separate notebook, green canvas cover, the size of a man's palm, filled with notes in a handwriting so compressed it required practice to read. Walter had found it in Arvid's desk drawer in 1962, a year after the funeral, and had read every page twice before he understood what his father had been doing in the summer of 1953. Arvid had been studying wild rice. Not the harvesting of wild rice from natural lakes and streams, which the Ojibwe had practiced for centuries, and which was well understood in northern Minnesota. Arvid had been studying the controlled flooding and cultivation of wild rice in managed paddies, a method that had been attempted in isolated locations in Wisconsin and Minnesota in the 1940s, and largely abandoned by conventional agriculture as too unpredictable, too labor-intensive, and insufficiently profitable for commodity markets. The notebook documented 14 separate flooded fields Arvid had visited in the summer of 1953. It recorded water depths, flooding schedules, grain yields per acre, and harvest methods at each site. And in one entry dated August 17, 1953, a single sentence that Walter had read so many times, he had stopped needing to open the notebook to see it. The water is not the problem. The water is the crop. Walter set the notebook on the workbench beside the pump and looked at both of them for a long time. Then he went to the house and told Ruth he was going to the Bemidji Public Library. If this kind of history means something to you, subscribe. These stories deserve more than to disappear. He spent 3 days in the library that December, pulling agricultural bulletins from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and photocopying pages from a 1949 University of Minnesota Extension report on paddy wild rice cultivation that had been filed and apparently not consulted since 1952. He found a name in the report, Dr. Erling Osheim, a botanist who had worked on wild rice genetics at the University of Minnesota in the late 1940s. He tracked down Osheim's last known affiliation, retired, living in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, through the university alumni office, and drove there on a Thursday in January of 1972 in a temperature of 11 degrees below zero. Osheim was 78 years old and lived alone in a house on the edge of Grand Rapids with bookshelves covering every wall of the main room. He poured Walter coffee without being asked and listened carefully while Walter described his North 40, his water depths, and his water table situation. When Walter finished, Osheim was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's your water depth in the center section?" 8 to 14 inches, Walter said. "Depends on the week." "Consistent source. The water table. It's not going anywhere." Osheim nodded slowly. He rose and pulled a folder from one of the lower shelves and set it on the table between them, typed pages with handwritten corrections in the margins. Field notes from 1948. "You want a depth of 6 to 10 inches during the growing period," he said, tracing a line with one finger. "You need control. You need to be able to raise and lower it. That's the whole problem with paddy rice. Not the crop, not the soil, not the chemistry, the water control." He looked up. "Do you have a way to move water?" Walter told him about the Lane and Bowler pump. Osheim sat back. He said, 400 gallons a minute. "Against 300 feet of lay flat," Walter said. The old man studied him for a moment. Then he said, "Most men who came to me about this didn't have the pump first." Walter Gundersen began the work in the spring of 1972. He did not call Krebs. He did not announce anything at the feed store. He drove to a culvert supplier in Bagley and bought $600 worth of corrugated steel pipe and fittings in cash. He rented a small dozer from a man named Carl Birch in Gonvik and spent 10 days in March moving earth along the south and west margins of the North 40, constructing a series of low earthen berms, 18 inches high, 4 feet wide at the base, that would allow him to control water movement across the field in sections. The ground was still frozen 6 inches down when he started. He worked in a canvas Carhartt jacket and wool-lined gloves that he replaced 3 times as the fingers wore through. The dozer was a 1955 Caterpillar D4 that Birch kept in careful condition, and Walter moved it the way he moved all machinery, deliberately, with no wasted passes. Each blade cut set before the previous one was finished. He divided the North 40 into 3 management cells. The east cell covered 11 acres, the deepest section where the water table sat highest. The center cell was 14 acres. The west cell was 6 acres and the shallowest, with the most variable flooding history. He installed hand-operated stop logs at 2 transfer points between cells, pressure-treated timber boards that slid into steel channel guides. He had welded himself in the shop, each one cut to a precise height that determined the water surface elevation in the receiving cell. The whole system, when he finished in late April, looked from the county road like a modest earthworks project of unclear purpose, which was precisely what it was until the water told a different story. Mervyn Holt drove past in his pickup and stopped on the road shoulder. He rolled down his window and looked at the berms for a while. Then he called out, "Walter, what are you building?" Walter was standing ankle-deep in the west cell, adjusting a stop log channel alignment. He looked up. "Water management," he said. Holt studied the construction for another moment. "You're going to farm a swamp," he said, and drove on. Walter went back to the stop log. He had ordered wild rice seed in February, Zizania palustris, a domesticated strain that Asheim had recommended from a specialty supplier in St. Paul. The order was 440 pounds at $1.85 per pound, delivered by freight truck to Bagley. He stored it in burlap sacks in his root cellar at between 35 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit to maintain seed viability, turning the sacks every 2 weeks to prevent anaerobic conditions from developing in the grain mass. The root cellar had held potatoes at the correct temperature for 30 years. It held wild rice seed equally well. In May, he seeded the east cell first, broadcasting the grain from the stern of a flat-bottomed aluminum boat he had bought secondhand in Bemidji for $40. The method was the one Arvid's notebook described from the 1953 site visits, broadcast onto the water surface at a rate of 80 pounds per acre, with the water level held at 4 inches. The seed would sink and anchor into the silted bottom within 36 hours, if conditions were right, then begin to germinate within 2 weeks. He seeded on a still morning in early May, when the wind was under 4 miles per hour, working the boat in parallel passes 15 feet apart, distributing the grain by hand from a 5-gallon bucket. Ruth watched from the berm edge for about 20 minutes, then drove back to the house without saying anything. Walter worked until the seed was gone. The summer of 1972 became the test of the water control system. June brought 16 inches of rain in Clearwater County, nearly double the monthly average, and the North 40's natural tendency was to flood beyond any useful growing depth. Walter ran the lane and boiler pump for 4 to 7 hours daily through June and July, moving excess water through a drainage swale to the east that discharged into the county right-of-way ditch. He tracked water depth with a measuring rod in each cell, a painted steel post with depth markings at half-inch intervals. He recorded the numbers in a separate ledger every morning. The operational goal was 6 to 8 inches in all 3 growing cells. He held it within 1 inch of that range for 11 consecutive weeks. He worked alone. Ruth brought lunch to the field edge on the days he did not come in. She left the plate on the berm and drove back to the house, and he picked it up when he was ready. At the Bagley Feed and Supply in July, someone mentioned that Walter Gundersen had some kind of water project operating on the North 40 and asked Krebs if he had any information. Krebs said he had driven past it twice and that Walter was, in his considered estimate, spending good money to build a more complicated version of the same problem he already had. He said it without malice. He said it the way a man speaks about a conclusion he no longer questions. The wild rice emerged in early June as a floating leaf stage that resembled aquatic grass spreading across the water surface. By the 3rd week of June, vertical culms had broken the surface and were climbing. By mid-July, the east cell stood under 4 to 5 feet of dense green stalks that moved in the afternoon wind with a sound like paper rustling at some distance. Walter checked the seed set weekly, pulling a culm to eye level and running his fingers along the panicle, pressing each grain to feel fill versus empty husks. He found a fill rate of roughly 70% in the east cell by the 1st week of August and entered the estimate in the ledger without further note. Then, in the 3rd week of August 1972, the pump stopped. He was running the evening discharge cycle, a 2-hour session intended to drop all 3 cells 4 inches before a forecast rain event, when the pump cavitated once, surged, and went silent. He checked the PTO engagement first, then the suction line for blockage, then the impeller housing. He found the problem in 40 minutes. The shaft seal had failed again, the same component he had replaced in 1968. Water had entered the bearing housing, and the impeller had developed a lateral wobble that was damaging the housing bore. He had no spare seal in stock. The part was a custom-fit item for the Model 14L12, and the nearest supplier who stocked lane and bowler components was in Minneapolis. He called Minneapolis that evening. The part was available. Minimum shipping time, 7 days. The weather forecast called for 2 inches of rain across the following 4 days. Walter did not sleep that night. He sat at the shop workbench with the pump disassembled on a clean tarp, a flashlight, a micrometer, and a set of inside calipers, measuring the seal bore dimension in 3 planes. By 2 a.m. he had established that a John Crane Type 1 mechanical seal, a standard plumbing supply item available at the Bemidji hardware store, was within 0.003 of an inch of the correct bore dimension. It was not a rated fit. It was a functional approximation. He drove to Bemidji when the hardware store opened at 7 in the morning. He had the improvised seal pressed and installed by noon. He ran the pump against the closed valve for 20 minutes, watching the housing flange for any weeping. There was none. He opened the valve and the pump ran. The rain came that afternoon and dropped 1.8 inches in 2 days. Walter ran the pump 16 hours across those 2 days, holding cell depths within range. He did not tell Ruth about the seal failure until October. He ordered 2 manufacturer specification replacements from Minneapolis the following week and stored them in the crate next to the pump on the shop shelf. By September of 1972, the east cell was ready for harvest. Walter had studied the harvest method from Osheim's field notes and from a conversation in August with James Brissett. an Ojibwe rice harvester from the Leech Lake area, whom he had contacted through the Red Lake tribal office. Brissett agreed to come to the farm for 2 days and evaluate Walter's technique. Brissett arrived on a Tuesday morning and walked the east cell perimeter without comment. Then he and Walter moved slowly through the standing rice in the aluminum boat. Brissett watched how Walter held the knocker sticks, 2 wooden dowels 30 inches long, smoothed with sandpaper, and how he pulled each culm over the gunnel and beat the grain into the hull. After about 10 minutes, Brissett said, "You're losing 30% over the side. Too hard." Walter adjusted his stroke. Brissett watched. "Better?" Brissett said. "Now slower." Walter slowed his stroke. The grain fell clean into the boat hull. Brissett stayed 2 days and said nothing that wasn't necessary. Walter paid him in cash. The east cell yielded 38 pounds of green rice per acre across 11 acres, 418 pounds total in that first harvest. After drying on clean tarps and parching in a large cast iron pan over an outdoor propane burner, the finished grain weighed out at 210 pounds. At commodity wild rice wholesale prices in 1972, roughly $1.20 per pound, that was 252 on 11 acres of ground that had produced nothing in 18 months. Thin. Arvid's notebook had anticipated this. The August 17, 1953 entry had continued past the sentence Walter always quoted: "The water is not the problem. The water is the crop. But the commodity buyer is not your customer. The restaurant is your customer." Walter drove to Minneapolis in October of 1972 with 50 pounds of parched wild rice in paper bags and a list of 7 restaurants that Osheim had provided, specifically places where the head chef made purchasing decisions rather than a procurement office. He found 4 of them willing to taste the grain. He left a half-pound sample at each location. 3 called him back within 2 weeks. One, a French-American restaurant in Minneapolis's warehouse district, offered $4.80 per pound for all he could supply. The chef, a man named Girard, told Walter by telephone that the grain was cleaner and more consistently sized than anything he had sourced from commercial distributors. He asked how much Walter could provide in 1973. Walter looked at his ledger. He said, "I'm expanding. If this story is worth your time, a subscription takes 2 seconds, and it means these stories keep getting made." The 1973 growing season covered all 3 cells for the first time. Walter flooded the west cell, seeded it in May at the same rate as the east, and hired 1 part-time laborer, Dennis Kranz, a 17-year-old from Bagley who had no opinion about wild rice and did precisely what he was instructed for the August and September harvest period. Total 1973 yield: 1,140 pounds of finished grain across 31 acres. At Girard's contracted price of $4.80 per pound, which Walter had renegotiated to $5.10 per pound in June, on the basis of a second successful season of samples, that was $5,114 gross on 31 acres. Corn ground in Clearwater County in 1973 averaged $187 per acre in gross revenue on a strong year. Walter's North 40 cleared $187 per acre. He wrote that number in the ledger and closed it. He carried it to the house and sat down to supper. When Ruth asked how the numbers looked, he said, "It's working." He did not say how well. Ruth set down her fork. She looked at him for a moment and then said, "Your father would have done this in the 50s if he'd had the water." Walter picked up his fork and continued eating. Word travels through farm country the way water travels through soil, indirectly, finding the path of least resistance, surfacing where you don't expect it. By the spring of 1974, 3 men in Clearwater County knew that Walter Gundersen was receiving restaurant prices for rice off the North 40. By fall of 1974, most people who sold seed or fuel or equipment in Bagley had heard the figure. The number, $5.10 per pound, moved through the county without Walter saying it to anyone, and arrived attached to a specific quality of silence. The silence of people who did not know what to do with information that contradicted what they had assumed. Donald Krebs heard the number from Mervyn Holt in November of 1974. He said, according to Holt, that Holt must have misheard. "That's not a commodity price," Krebs said. "That's a specialty price. It doesn't scale." Holt told him that Walter had sold to the same Minneapolis restaurant for 3 consecutive seasons and had added a second account in 1974. That the North 40, which Krebs had recommended selling to a duck hunter for $800 total, had earned more than $5,000 in a single growing season. Krebs drove out to the Gundersen farm on a Thursday in December. Walter was in the west cell replacing one of the stop log channel guides, knee-deep in cold water, working with a post-hole digger and a bag of hydraulic cement to reset a guide rail that had shifted during the fall drawdown. Krebs stood at the berm edge in his county truck and watched him work. Then he said, "Walter, I'd like to see the whole operation, if you're willing." Walter climbed out of the cell and walked Krebs through all 3 management cells, the pump system, the seeding and harvest methods, the water depth records running back to May of 1972. He opened the crop ledger and showed Krebs the yield and price entries. He showed him Osheim's field notes. Then he went to the shop and took the green canvas notebook from the crate and handed it to Krebs. Krebs read Arvid's notebook standing at the workbench without speaking. When he reached the August 17, 1953 entry, he stopped and read it twice. He looked up at the pump on its skid frame. He looked at the depth records on the wall. He read the entry a 3rd time. He set the notebook on the bench. "I told you to sell this ground for duck hunting," he said. Walter said nothing. "I was wrong about the land." Krebs looked at the pump again. "I was wrong about the water, too. I saw what it wasn't. I didn't look for what it was." Walter picked up the notebook and returned it to the crate. He pulled a photocopied set of pages from a manila folder on the shelf, the 1949 University of Minnesota Extension Bulletin on paddy wild rice cultivation, the same pages he had pulled at the Bemidji Library in December of 1971, and handed them to Krebs. "You're going to have questions from other people," Walter said. "You should probably know what's in there first." The University of Minnesota's Agricultural Extension Service published a field report on managed paddy wild rice cultivation in Clearwater and Beltrami counties in the spring of 1976. Walter Gundersen's North 40 was cited as one of 3 case study properties. The report used his water depth records, his 4-year yield data, and his price history as the primary data set for the small farm economics section. A researcher named Patricia Solom from the university's plant biology department spent 2 days at the farm in the summer of 1975, documenting the berm system, the stop log design, and the pump setup. She photographed everything. She asked Walter, at the end of her 2nd day, if he had any interest in a research partnership with the university extension program. "No," he said. She wrote that down in her notebook and thanked him for his time. Donald Krebs began listing paddy wild rice as a viable land use option for persistently saturated marginal acres in his county extension consultations starting in the spring of 1975. At the County Extension Advisory Board's March meeting, he told the board that he had been presented with field evidence he had previously failed to evaluate properly. He distributed photocopied pages of the 1949 bulletin to 7 farmers in Clearwater and Polk counties that year. None of them replicated exactly what Walter had done, but 2 of them converted portions of flooded ground that had been written off as a total loss to managed wetland crop production. Neither of them sold their land to a duck hunter. Mervyn Holt stopped by the Gundersen farm in August of 1975. Walter was working the east cell in the aluminum boat, running the morning harvest pass. Holt stood at the berm edge and watched the boat move through the rice. The stalks were taller than they had been in 1972, the panicles heavier. The morning light turned the water between the culms copper and dark. It did not look like a ruined farm field. It did not look like anything Holt had a ready word for. After a while, Holt said, "I told Krebs back in 71 I'd give you 800 for this section if you wanted to cut your losses." "I know," Walter said from the boat. Holt watched the harvest for another few minutes. He said, mostly to himself, $800. Walter did not look up from the knocker sticks. If these stories matter to you, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it keeps this kind of history from disappearing. By the early 1980s, the North 40 produced between 1,400 and 1,800 pounds of finished wild rice per season, depending on the year's rainfall, selling to 6 restaurant accounts across Minneapolis and St. Paul at prices between $5.50 and $6.80 per pound. The operation had not changed in its fundamental methods since 1972. The berm system had been reinforced twice. The stop-log channels had been rebuilt once. The lane and boulder pump was still on its original cast iron impeller housing. The improvised shaft seal replaced 3 times. The gear reducer on its second oil charge. The skid frame welded in 2 places where the original welds had developed stress cracks. Walter maintained the pump on the first Saturday of every month without exception. He ran it for 20 minutes against the closed valve, checked the seal housing for any weeping, changed the gear reducer oil each spring, and kept 2 manufacturer specification shaft seals in the wooden crate on the shop shelf. In 1983, his grandson Paul began coming to the farm for summer weeks. Paul was 11 that year, and the kind of child who asked questions about things that appeared to have obvious answers, which Walter understood as evidence of a mind that was working properly. In the summer of 1985, Paul watched the monthly pump maintenance from a stool against the shop wall. Walter ran the pump through its 20-minute cycle, checked the housing, changed a grease fitting, and began replacing the housing cover. Paul said, "Why do you run it every month? The season's over." Walter set the cover bolts with the wrench. "The pump doesn't care what the calendar says. If it sits, it seizes. If it seizes in May, when you need it, you lose the crop." Paul thought about this. What if it never fails while you're running it? "Then you know it won't," Walter said. Paul turned that over. "But you can't actually know that." "No," Walter said, "but you know it hasn't." He handed Paul a clean rag. Paul wiped down the discharge port, housing the way he had watched Walter do it, in one direction, then the other, following the casting seams, without being told which direction to wipe. In the summer of 1992, Walter sat at the kitchen table with Paul, who was 20 that year, and studying agricultural science at the University of Minnesota, and walked him through the green canvas notebook page by page. Not to explain the history, Walter was not a man who treated history as something to be explained. He walked Paul through the notebook as a technical document, what the water depth entries meant, how Arvid had graded soil texture at each site, what the yield notations in the margin columns indicated, and what they indicated about water control as the primary variable across all 14 field visits. When they reached the August 17, 1953 entry, Paul read it twice and looked up. He knew, Paul said. He knew, Walter said. He just didn't have the water. Paul looked at him. You said he didn't have the pump. Same thing, Walter said. Paul asked where the pump was. Walter took him to the shop. They ran it together that afternoon. 20 minutes against the closed valve, the impeller spinning at 1,450 RPM inside the same cast iron housing Arvid had bought in Beltrami County for $62 in 1954. The discharge pressure held at its rated value. Paul checked the seal housing with his palm pressed flat against the casting and felt nothing. No vibration, no warmth from friction, no weeping at the flange. He said, "It still runs exactly right." Walter said, "It always has." Walter Gundersen died in November of 1997 at the age of 89. He had maintained the pump ledger through September of that year. The final entry, dated September 6, 1997, recorded a water depth of 7.5 inches in the east cell, a fill rate estimate of 71%, and a projected yield of 1,280 pounds. The actual harvest weight was 1,341 pounds. The ledger showed no entry for the discrepancy. Paul Gundersen took over management of the North 40 in 1998. He expanded to 12 restaurant and specialty food accounts by 2003. He was cited in a 2006 University of Minnesota Extension Bulletin on small-scale paddy wild rice production as an example of sustained methodology, a technique developed without institutional support and maintained across 3 decades without institutional modification. He maintained the lane and bowler pump on the first Saturday of every month. The pump had never failed during a growing season. The North 40 had not grown a row of corn since 1969. The water table had never come back down. If you stayed for all of it, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and they deserve to be told. There is a particular kind of knowledge that institutions cannot generate because it requires a specific relationship with a specific piece of ground across a specific number of years. The kind of knowledge that dies when a man dies, or survives because someone thought to write it down in a green canvas notebook, and someone else thought to read it 30 years after it was written. Arvid Gundersen stood at the edge of someone else's flooded field in the summer of 1953 and understood that the water was not the problem. Walter Gundersen stood at the edge of his own flooded ground in September of 1971 and understood that his father had already found the answer and had spent 17 years maintaining the equipment required to act on it, waiting for the question to arrive. The North 40 did not succeed because Walter Gundersen refused to give up. It succeeded because 2 men, in 2 different decades, looked at water where water was not supposed to be, and asked not how to remove it, but what it was for.